This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional life that you're happy with. On this episode, I speak with an old friend, researcher, author, and speaker, Dr. Alexandra Samuel. She's the author of the book Work Smarter with Social Media from the Harvard Business Review Press and the forthcoming book Remote Inc. Alex is a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and JSTOR. She holds her PhD in political science from Harvard and her BA from Oberlin. I wanted to have Alex on the podcast because of an article she wrote for the Wall Street Journal in the early days of the COVID pandemic titled, How to Network When You Can't Meet Up with People. But ultimately, we talked about so much more, including authenticity, vulnerability, digital well-being, email, and productivity. I hope you'll enjoy my conversation on careers and professional life with Dr. Alexandra Samuel. Alex and I have known each other for 15 years, first meeting at a conference on a small island in Canada. And we have stayed in touch mostly through social media over that time. And I have followed her career and her writing and been impressed with the way that she puts a very fine point on the advice that she offers. I wanted to have her on the podcast to talk about networking in this pandemic era that we're in because of an article that she recently had in the Wall Street Journal titled How to Network When You Can't Meet Up with People. So welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Thanks so much for having me, Gregory.
So in your article, you outlined a few different ways that you have come to build your network and strengthen your network and network with new people while being remote, because your career for the last decade or so has mostly been remote. Can you tell me a little bit about that shift for you from networking mostly in person to then networking online?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with my location. I'm in Vancouver, BC, and I was about to say in the very early days of our business, our work was local, but to be entirely honest, our first couple of clients were not even local. And so there was a period of time when my husband and I were running what you would now call a social media agency, building online communities, where we had a number of clients in Vancouver and we had employees in Vancouver. But really over the arc of the past 20 years of my career, there really have only been a couple of periods in which my work and colleagues have primarily been local. Most of the time, I've been working either with clients in other parts of the world, writing for publications that are mostly based in the US, working for an organization, a company based in Toronto. And so when you live in a place where the professional opportunities are mostly elsewhere, then the internet is a real blessing, and social media and social networking is a real blessing because it allows you to create a professional network that is, essentially location agnostic. And that's what I won't even say I tried to do. It's kind of what happened by the virtue of my work being elsewhere.
And around the time that we came to know each other, I was in a similar situation, working in Seattle mostly, and mostly with remote teams and clients who were all over the world as well. So it was sort of out of necessity. We were perhaps a decade and a half ahead of the rest of the world with this remote interaction. What are some of the top lessons that you feel like you learned that are transferable to where we are now?
Well, it's funny rereading that article I wrote for the journal in light of our conversation, because frankly, so much, it really strikes me how much of my own kind of model and approach to this is a function of the very specific social group that I developed and collegial group I developed through the conference where I met you, which is this group called Web of Change. And there have been a few different events I've attended over the years that have had something of that character, where there's a sense that, if you were in this room with people, even if you didn't spend 3 hours one-on-one, there is a strong sense of affinity and a strong sense of trust that transfers online and makes that feel like a meaningful connection. And for me, the relationships that I've developed with people online through those communities, through the kind of handful of networks that feel really meaningful and trusted in that way, have kind of served as a model for all of my online relationships. And the piece that I really emphasize to people, particularly because, so much of the dynamics of social media and social networks really cue us to kind of take a notching the bedpost kind of approach, right? LinkedIn is constantly trying to feed you more connections. Facebook is constantly trying to get you to accept more friend requests. But more is not at all more. And, investing in relationships that are real and where you actually care about the person and you believe in their work and you're trying to support each other, it truly is better to have 10 of those relationships than 1,000 LinkedIn connections. And so, when I advise people how to think about their social networking, it really is prioritizing quality over quantity and focusing on the relationships that really enrich your work, broadly understood, and that allow you to help other people do work that you believe in.
Would you have advice for mid-career professionals? A lot of my listeners are getting their MBA, right? So they're about to make a switch. They have this 2-year experience while they're getting their MBA, and they are looking to build a network in the industry or set of companies or even geographic area that they hope to move into. So I'm wondering what advice you would have for someone in that position where it's in some ways less building off of what they've done over the last few years, but more prospective, looking forward to what they want to do. And again, not having that intense conference experience where you might go and meet some people for a few days and really bond. How would you advise people in that situation?
Yeah, it's so funny you ask, because I actually have been writing a couple of things on this exact question around mid-career change and thinking about how to build those relationships from scratch. So my usual advice to people about social media generally is you kind of need to think about your shtick, your turf. What is it that you are going to carve out? And 100,000 years ago, when the internet was young and you and I first met, I mean, it's so crazy to think about this. Like my kind of first go at having an online shtick was I was the person who talked about social media, like literally. And that was specific enough that being like a social media expert meant something. And now, that's like so broad, you couldn't even begin to try and be that person. So what I usually advise is, think about 2 or 3 different subjects or like a couple of subjects and a location and make that your niche. So you aren't going to be, the social media person, but you might be the person who talks about social media in HR in Seattle. You're not going to be the expert on financial management strategy, but you might be the best expert on financial management for millennials who want to have socially responsible investment strategies. And so if you can kind of put yourself at the intersection of 2 or 3 different kind of topics or locations like that, then you can start to kind of build a shtick for yourself. And, a lot of people will talk about that as personal brand management, which is a terrible way to think about it, both like karmically and practically. I think it's a lot more useful to think about, how can you cultivate an expertise that will make you helpful to other people? How can you be helpful? The people we want to engage with are the people who are generous rather than self-promoting. And so if you can approach it in that spirit of generosity and the spirit of being helpful, really keep your attention focused on what am I adding here, then you're going to, make a lot more progress in building the relationships that can be helpful to you.
It's one of the edicts that I feel that I've lived by for quite a while, this idea of always adding value and being of service to other people. Having that mindset of generosity rather than a sort of transactional conception of what networking can be or what building your network is, I think can really drive a lot of results in building your network. When you show up at the right moment with the right piece of information or with the right connection for other people, that can be pivotal in other people's lives and cause them to remember you and then be more generous in kind with you. You write about this idea of generosity and being in service, but you also talk about vulnerability in that article and in some of your other writing. And I wonder how you think about balancing this idea of professionalism with vulnerability, especially now during such a difficult time in the world.
So, I mean, I think that one of the challenges in any of this is that each of us can only be who we are. And honestly, it really isn't, there's a reason everybody talks about authenticity on social media. And that's because at the end of the day, we all are, emotional creatures, and we are drawn to the people whose stories feel true. So the idea of allowing yourself to be vulnerable is part of what conveys a sense of authenticity. But that is not authentic if you are somebody who is not comfortable exposing yourself online. And, one of the things I've kind of come to realize about myself as a human is I have like a, compulsive need for over disclosure. Like it's, I think the way some people like to, bungee jump or skydive or, go on roller coasters even for this like adrenaline rush of physical risk, I have that feeling around emotional risk. I like to just like edge myself out a little bit past my comfort level, sometimes a lot past my comfort level, and that is what delete buttons are for. But there's something for me that is like I crave that sense of like putting myself out there, sharing something that is really upsetting even to me professionally. Like if I've had something where I feel like I didn't really live up to what I needed to do, or where I feel like I'm not sure if the way I'm talking about a particular issue is appropriate, I will actually put that out there. And I feel like for me, what has ended up happening is to some extent, I feel like some of what I do for people is I create the space for them to talk about the stuff they're kind of ashamed to talk about. So, for one example, a lot of my work in the past, 15 years has been around digital well-being, as we would now call it, and then around digital parenting. And, when I first started writing about using technology more intentionally, I was kind of trying to give voice to my own feeling of like, I really didn't want to have to apologize for what a lot of people were starting to characterize as addictive technology use. And I wanted to give people permission to spend a lot of time touching their phones and to give people a framework for talking about that didn't have to be, seen as pathological. And similarly, when it comes to talking about kids and technology, I feel like I wanted to reframe the conversation about limiting screen time to acknowledging the fact that a lot of us are super maxed out as parents, and, handing the kid an iPad is sometimes better than screaming at them. And so I think that one of the things that happens when you allow yourself to be vulnerable online is that it makes you relatable because you're talking about the things that other people are kind of afraid to acknowledge.
I think I need to disclose that while you were speaking, my son came to the door with his iPad, like wanting me to enter the code to give him more screen time.
Yes,
it's real. The struggle is real.
It is.
But let me come back to something you said earlier about this idea of putting yourself in a spot where you're maybe at the intersection of developing an expertise around something, and maybe that has a geographic nature to it. I've seen some of our students at the Foster School of Business use the networking that they do, the informational interviews that they conduct to learn about jobs and industries, to then write articles that they put on LinkedIn or their own blogs to be in service, essentially, of other people who are going through this MBA experience and will benefit from learning what they have learned through conversations with 5 product managers at tech companies around Seattle, or through working, with an angel investing group or venture capital firm. And they then become that little expert where they can be in service. And it also gives them a way to acknowledge the people who have helped them, either individually or the companies, and elevate their, I know you talked about personal brand being a bad kind of like maybe not the best framing, but to elevate their personal brand. It's like, oh, this is somebody who knows about tech product management in Seattle because they wrote a LinkedIn article and it's been shared all these times and other people have commented on it and found it useful. So I think that is a way that, not all of us have giant platforms, or writing for major publications, but that is a small way that a student who is maybe gathering information and learning about an industry can then synthesize that information and share it on a platform like Medium or LinkedIn to be in service of other students, and then perhaps attract people to them through that.
Absolutely. And, I mean, my entire career really has unfolded that way. And I don't think I don't want people to feel uncomfortable about wanting to cultivate a reputation. I just tend to talk about reputation rather than brand, because I feel like, as a friend pointed out to me, the whole idea of a brand was a way of giving a product or a company a personality, but people have personalities. That's what makes us people.
We already have them. Yeah.
Like, I find it more that the language of personal brand it obscures the fact that we're actually talking about people and human relationship. And frankly, your networking ultimately will be successful to the extent that you keep the focus on relationship. And so, reputation is essentially letting people know, the best way really to think about it is like, how will people figure out how I can be helpful to them? Oh, I will have a reputation as good in these specific ways or knowledgeable in these specific ways. And then the trick is just, to look for the places where that specific knowledge or where that specific expertise can be helpful to somebody you want to connect with. And, I've had, like, honestly, all of my most interesting professional opportunities in the past decade really have come through things I've put out online that somebody has then, essentially stumbled across and reached out to me around. And then the only quote unquote trick is that I actually pay enough attention and I'm responsive enough that I then have taken those moments of outreach and turned them into a larger conversation. So for example,
like this podcast, this podcast.
Exactly. There you go. Well, and you're a great example, you're a great example, right? So if you don't mind me saying this, like, I get a lot of podcast, people who, the world is full of people with social media presences now.
Some of them in your own house.
Yes, quite a few of them in my own house. And so, the reason you and I are talking is because of our personal relationship, right? And that I know that you are thoughtful and interesting. I'm fond of you. And so when you're thinking about that opportunity to, build a presence, part of it is about thinking of, like, who do I know who is interesting and who will have ideas that they can share with me? And then I can, part of the service I'm providing is to amplify that. And that's about knowing, your own medium too, right? Like, one of the things I think has been great about the past few years of social media is that in the early olden days, you really had to be a writer, right? I mean, when it was all blogging, you were either a good writer or you weren't. And if you weren't, there wasn't really a whole lot you could do to promote yourself or build or be of service on social media. But now there are people who are fabulous interviewers, right? Who can do great podcasts. There are people who do amazing images and speak visually on Instagram. There are people who are, fabulous on camera and do stuff on Facebook Live or YouTube. And so I think it's just really important to think about, like, how do you love to communicate? How do you show up in ways that other people find compelling? And then, that's the way that you should go about building your presence.
That's great. So it's like find your niche and then find your platform, your medium, essentially, not medium the platform, but find the medium that you like to work in and run with it
Exactly. And I do think, by the way, speaking of medium, that the other thing to think about is like, you don't have to build everything from scratch anymore. And, time was, I told anyone who wanted to have a social media anything that they had to set up a WordPress blog, basically. You and I have spent a lot of time comparing WordPress notes over the years. But I mean, I can't imagine, well, no, I can't imagine telling some people to do that still, but for most people, if you were starting from scratch now, you would start on an existing platform. You would start with Medium, you would start with LinkedIn, you would start with Facebook. And, when you go someplace that people are already there, it just makes it so much easier.
Yeah, I've built plenty of sites that don't exist anymore because it's just, it's just hard to maintain over time, and it's hard to get people to go to where you are. It is better to go where the people are. And there are platforms that have very active communities that are professional, like Medium and like LinkedIn.
Yeah.
You said something earlier about that being responsive. And I think this brings me to the next area of questioning and topic that you've written about, which is productivity and email. I know you have some strong opinions about this. Can you talk about your approach to digital communication that is not of the social media variety?
Well, I mean, here's my first confession. My first confession is, I figured out my email approach, which is still, basically my email approach. I'm trying to remember when I wrote the first blog post about it, probably 12 years ago, something like that. And at the time I was running my own business. I had like 10 people working for me. I had a couple of dozen clients, and like email was a nightmare. And my approach was very much driven by, I'd missed several media and business opportunities, inquiries from prospective clients, because I'd gotten so behind my email that they'd kind of gotten lost in the flood. And I realized that I needed to have a better solution. 10 years later, I have found the ultimate solution on email. The ultimate solution on email is be a freelance writer. It involves very little email. It's really wonderful. And, I think back even to, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago when I was last working inside a larger company. And, the pain of email, I think it's better now that we have Slack. But basically, like, the problem with email is the problem of organizations and the way people work in organizations. And, when I'm in the period of the year, which I'm in right now, where I'm working with a couple of large organizational clients, my email volume probably 10 times higher than it will be in another 4 months when I go back to just freelance writing. And once every 2 weeks, I exchange an email with an editor. Super awesome. And like, really seriously, if you hate email, I had a business coach who said to me years ago, like, if you hate meetings, then you need to reevaluate the nature of your work, because a lot of work does involve a ton of meetings. And so, you kind of either have to come to terms with that or you need to restructure your work. And I would say the same is true for email. Like, if you seriously hate email, move to a company that works off of Slack, move to a line of work that is not so email centric. Not every corner of the world requires you to look at 500 emails a day. That said, if you are in a job you love that has 500 emails a day, my basic religion on this is, what I always say to people is like, for everyone, there's some volume of email at which you admit you will not read and reply to everything. And, whether that's 50 emails a day or 500 emails a day, I always paraphrase the Shaw line, now we're just negotiating on a price. So once you admit that there's some volume of email at which it is no longer feasible to deal with it all, then you need to step back and say, okay, where am I going to draw that line? And what happens to a lot of us in practice is that the line between how much I'll see and respond to and what I'm going to ignore is kind of based on just like capacity. When it lands in your inbox, if it happened to land in the 5 minutes in between meetings when you're looking at your email, you see it. If it landed in the middle of a block of 4 meetings, you just might miss it altogether. And what you really want is to make sure that the email you see and prioritize is actually the most important email, not just the most recent email. And equally important, you want to make sure that your time on email isn't crowding out more important work. And I talk to people all the time who are like, I had to write my really important quarterly report in 2 hours because I spent the whole week dealing with email. Well, that's not necessarily reflective of what actually deserved your time.
This is like the Cal Newport deep work concept.
Yes, I guess it is. It's so funny. I never think of it that way. But yes, it's true that even I need to have time where things aren't pinging at me so that I can work. And I say that just because I am a kind of chronic multitasker and I'm able to switch tasks pretty efficiently. So anyhow, my religion is basically like set up a ton of, I call them alternate inboxes. Think about, your email in terms of the different levels of priority. So when I was running my own business, I had, internal emails that were directed to me, were in one folder. Internal emails that were CC'd to me went in a different folder. Client emails that were CC'd to me went into a different folder. Newsletters went into a different folder. And I set up mail rules to sort of play traffic cop and put things in those different folders, what I called alternate inboxes. And so then when I look at my inbox, the only stuff that should be in my inbox is stuff that is coming in externally to me, not CC to me, but to me, or potentially stuff that has the word like urgent in it, or, emails from my clients that are really urgent. And that means that my inbox is by definition going to be my top priority email. And I don't miss the client inquiries, the new editor inquiries, and so on. And then, in the afternoon when I've already gotten my most important work done, then I go in and I look at what I've been CC'd on. Then I go in and I look at the internal emails from my team saying, hey, we need to invoice so-and-so. But what I don't want is to have those things show up in my main inbox in a way that creates the risk I'll miss something that's really essential.
I have a very similar approach, and it was actually born out of a limitation in the iPhone mail app when it first came out, which is that it only showed a certain number of recent emails. And I was getting, 500 emails a day, so I would only see the most recent 50 emails.
Yes.
So I actually set up different email boxes. And I said, okay, all the newsletters are going to go to news at this, domain, and all of the receipts, whenever I buy something, I'm going to use this address. And all my personal communication is going to have a different address. And I've kept that going, and it allows me to very easily filter because it's on the incoming email address.
Yes. I do. I know people who use that approach, and if you use Gmail, you don't even necessarily need a separate email per se. You can, sort of
use the plus sign.
Exactly. Add a plus sign to your name. And if somebody Googles, create additional email addresses in Gmail with a plus sign, you'll find this trick.
It is a total power user Jedi move.
It is. Yeah. The other thing I recommend, which is the opposite, it's like so super not a Jedi move, but it's really good psychologically, is I now unsubscribe to something a few times a day. I mean, because the reality is email newsletters and sales promotional newsletters are like the bamboo of the internet. It doesn't matter how many times you cut back and unsubscribe, they will always grow back. And I find if I get off a phone call where somebody's pissed me off, or my mom has just texted me and I'm feeling annoyed because she's nagging me, even though I'm 49 years old. It's, unsubscribing to an email newsletter is a really awesome way of channeling my aggression. And it feels really, I don't know, it just feels very empowering. And I just love unsubscribing to things. And so, just for a while, I was religious about as soon as I saw something I didn't want, I would unsubscribe to it. Now I'm not like that. Now I sort of save it up for when I have some aggression issues to work out.
We're kindred spirits. I spent a couple minutes the other day unsubscribing from some sales promotion emails. But I am also, I am a Gallup certified Clifton Strengths coach, and one of my strengths is input. And my input strength drives me to subscribe to newsletters and I'm also have a high learner. So I want to learn new things and I want to collect resources. So I have this tension where I'm subscribing to these things and then oftentimes also high activator. So I'm like, I should totally subscribe to this. But then I don't read it. But it's there in case, and I can do a search and I can find something. So it's a tension that I live in every day.
That's so funny. I almost never subscribe. I mean, I did actually just recently subscribe to a bunch of Wall Street Journal email newsletters because it occurred to me it would be a good way of keeping an eye on what else they've covered so I know what to not pitch. But for the most part, I would say 98% of my email newsletters are things that are, I mean, part of it is because I'm a writer. I get it on a lot of PR newsletters, including a lot of beauty ones, because there's another writer named Alexandra who's a beauty writer. So I get a lot of like email newsletters about bath salts. But it's mostly stuff, it's kind of a byproduct of being online. You donate to somebody, suddenly you're getting 2 new email newsletters from the 2 different organizations who are part of the fundraiser. You buy a pair of shoes, or God forbid, even look at a pair of shoes, and suddenly 5 different people are emailing you shoes.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the reasons why I think this is important, this conversation about email, is because a lot of students, when they're reaching out to people to network, to get that coffee chat conversation, informational interview, they're asking, well, what's the best way? Do I email them? Do I connect on LinkedIn, on some other platform? And I'm wondering, absent the strategy of, amplifying, becoming or entering their sort of peripheral awareness or ambient awareness that like you exist because you've commented on things they've written, or you've promoted those things. Oftentimes, someone deep inside a tech company, they might not be writing things, right? What do you think is a good strategy for making that connection or for cutting through the email clutter? Like, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So first of all, I never, ever recommend outreach via LinkedIn. I hugely recommend finding your prospects via LinkedIn, but then make the connection via email. And in particular, what I try and do, and this is why I'm pretty selective about who I connect with on LinkedIn. I try to only connect on LinkedIn with people I actually know well enough to ask for an introduction. And so, for example, the way I ended up writing for Oprah magazine, which is for their website, which was a really useful credit for me at a kind of key moment in my career, is that I just like every 6 months, I would go and look at who do I know who knows somebody at Oprah. And eventually one day somebody popped up who I knew really well. And I reached out to him and I said, do you know this guy at Oprah well enough to introduce me? And he did. And I wrote an introduction for my friend to send. And so it all happened via email, but it happened through a person. It wasn't even me emailing the guy and saying, hey, I see we both know so-and-so. My friend took the email I wrote and emailed his contact there and said, I would like to introduce Alexandra Samuel. And so to the extent that you can get a personal introduction, and the way to do that is by drafting it yourself. If you see that you know somebody who knows somebody on LinkedIn, write the introduction you would want them to send and say, I don't know if you know so-and-so well enough to feel like you can make this introduction, but if you can, here is a draft email to send them. So that's like numero uno strategy.
I love that you just said that, because that is advice that I give over and over again. You want to lower the barrier for the person who you're asking to do the favor as much as possible.
Yes.
And in that, you can be very specific about the reason why you want the introduction.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You can make your own case.
Yes. And it's also, frankly, one of the reasons I think it is useful to have a social media presence is I think the informational interview is it's a hard ask. It's a difficult ask. And I'm always more receptive to people who are saying, do you have 15 minutes to talk to me for an article I'm writing? Do you have half an hour to do a guest lecture in my class? Like if there's if the thing they're asking me to connect around is something that is going to have multiplier value, and that sounds like it's maybe it's a self-promotion thing, but to be honest, it's more about like scale of impact. I just sadly don't have the time to talk to that many people. And so I'd rather do it in a forum that's going to help more people. So that's, just one part of it. And then I think the other thing when you don't send the email that says, if you're willing to make the introduction, then I'll send you an introduction. Take the time to write the introduction and include it in that first email, because then you've just reduced a source of friction, and it's easier for the person to say yes.
Right. And it's one less email in everybody's inbox.
One less email in everybody's inbox. And they know, they don't have to wonder, well, what is she going to be asking me to say? They can see what you're asking them to say, and then they can make the decision. And then if you don't have that in, I will say some of it's just the luck of the draw. If your email happens to hit somebody's inbox at the right moment. For me, a lot of what determines who I reply to is whether it resonates personally. So, I wrote a long email to somebody recently because they emailed me and they said, hey, I just read your article in the Wall Street Journal, and then I noticed you had a PhD, and I noticed it was in political science, and I'm just super curious because I'm in the middle of my PhD and I'm not sure I want to go into my field. How the heck do you go from a PhD in political science to writing for the Wall Street Journal? Like, how did that happen? And, it was more of a personal thing. It created a sense of resonance. And I think it would not be very hard for you to for anyone to figure out from, if you looked at my Twitter account, at my Twitter feed, and you read 10 of my tweets, or you looked at me on Facebook and read my most recent public posts, you would figure out that if you reach out to talk to me about your autistic kid or your love of show tunes, or how you feel about the iPad versus the iPhone or Star Trek, those are all places where I'm going to feel a sense of kinship.
Yeah, game on.
Do not try and fake your way through a Star Trek conversation. You gotta know your show tunes. You gotta know your Star Trek before you try those angles. But a lot of people disclose enough about themselves online that you can find some point of kinship that will make them more inclined to reply.
Let's shift gears as we draw this conversation to a close. I want to give you an opportunity to preview some of what we might see in your upcoming book, Remote Inc., How to Thrive at Work Wherever You Are. We've had students who have been working remotely this summer on their internships, and we imagine that many experiences they have in the foreseeable future will have a significant remote component. Are there some highlights you can share?
So I would say the key message of our book is that the most important thing you can do for your productivity as a remote worker is really about your mindset. And I think the challenge that a lot of people have when they first start working remotely is they are trying to make remote work feel or work like it worked in an office. And the thing is, offices have a really strong comparative advantage when it comes to collaboration. It's really easy to sit down and work as a team. When you're all side by side, you can just step into the meeting room. You can all look at each other in the eye. You can read each other's body language. Offices are not so great, as we were just discussing, for deep work, focused work, writing that report, really thinking deeply about the new campaign strategy. And so what happens when we move to remote work is if we keep trying to do everything on a collaborative model, we're trying to do everything in a second best way and making it very hard for ourselves to succeed. And so I actually think the shift to remote work is a lot more successful for people who are willing, and organizations who are willing to shift the balance between individual and collaborative work and foster a more kind of independent and entrepreneurial attitude among workers, where instead of saying, thinking of everything in terms of the team, you think, what is the piece here that I can just really succeed at, really wow my boss, really wow my colleagues, really help people, but I don't have to be necessarily in touch with them every step along the way. And the more that people can kind of get into that more entrepreneurial headspace, get into a more independent way of working, the more they're going to be both effective at remote work and also happy, because it's not a daily exercise in frustration.
Well, I know I want to read the book now and have you back on to talk just about that, perhaps after it comes out. So I just want to take the time to thank you so much for coming on for a conversation on careers and professional life.
It's been just so lovely to reconnect, and good luck to your listeners.
The three things that I keep thinking about since recording this conversation with Alex are the ideas that more is not more, And when it comes to networking, focusing on quality over quantity is the best strategy. Secondly, the importance of vulnerability and authenticity when establishing your personal reputation and growing your network. And lastly, her advice that putting yourself into the position of becoming a mini expert and adding value to your network is a great way to build that network. You can find Alex on Twitter at awsamuel or her website, alexandrasamuel.com. As always, I'll put links to some of the articles as well as to Alex's Twitter feed and website in the show notes, which you can find at conversationsoncareers.com. Thank you for listening to another episode of Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. You can email me at gheller@uw.edu. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or classmate.